During the 2000s, the Phoenix Suns were one of the more entertaining and innovative teams in the NBA. With an offense iconically named 7 Seconds or Less that was quarterbacked by a two-time MVP in Steve Nash, coached by a brilliant offensive mind in Mike D'Antoni, a couple of athletic forwards in Stoudemire and Marion, sprinkling a few three-point shooters, and there you have it. A 50-60 win team that constantly was competing for a championship during the latter half of the decade. And in 2010, it seemed as if they had gotten over the hump, as Phoenix was able to overcome their arch rivals in the San Antonio Spurs, but still fell short in the conference finals to the Los Angeles Lakers. Little did we know that would be the last time the Suns would make the playoffs for the next 9 years. Yes, the Phoenix Suns have the second longest active postseason drought in the NBA, only behind the Sacramento Kings. But unlike the Kings, somehow, someway, the Suns find themselves getting worse as they finished the regular season last year with a 19-63 record. So how exactly did we get here? Well, first we have to go back to the beginning of the decade, and between the summer of 2010 and 2012, the Phoenix Suns lost both of their franchise players in Amar'e Stoudemire and Steve Nash. First, Stoudemire was lost in the offseason of 2010 as the star forward went into the summer as a free agent. Now, normally when you have a franchise player who is 27 years old coming off of another great season in which he was selected to make an All-NBA team, normally a franchise will give that type of player a max contract, but not the Phoenix Suns, and Stoudemire found himself playing in New York for the Knicks via sign and trade. Through the remainder of the summer, the Suns found themselves trying to fill the void that Amar'e Stoudemire was going to leave behind by signing and trading for a bunch of forwards, and obviously it didn't work. And for the next 2 years, regardless of the amount of trades and acquisitions that transpired, the Suns at best were a 500 ball club that was nowhere near close to making the playoffs, which thus brings us to the 2012 offseason and the inevitable rebuild. As this time, Steve Nash entered the offseason as a free agent, and at best the organization was stalling at a 500 record and Nash was declining. So yeah, moving in a different direction was just the most logical thing to do. And during the offseason, they decided to trade Steve Nash to the Los Angeles Lakers and in return receive 4 draft picks, 2 of which were first rounders. Prior to trading Steve Nash, the Suns decided to select Kendall Marshall in the 2012 draft in hopes that he would be his successor, which thus means we have a full-blown rebuild on our hand. They gave a swing at players such as PJ Tucker and Luis Scola during the offseason. They traded Hakeem Warwick, amnesty Josh Childress, who was on a horrific contract, and later on down the line, they brought in Marcus Morris to try to figure out his value through a trade with the Houston Rockets, who is a twin brother of Markieff Morris, who they drafted during the 2011 draft. But easily what was the most impactful but yet still confusing transaction was acquiring Goran Dragic during the 2012 offseason. The reason why this was so impactful is that Dragic would go on to prove that he indeed was a starting caliber point guard in the NBA. The reason why this was so confusing is because Goran Dragic was originally on the team, but he was traded just a year and a half ago to the Houston Rockets, and along with him went a 2011 first round pick. So if they were patient and willing to build with Dragic, they wouldn't have to trade him as well as that first round pick just to turn around and sign him back again once he was a free agent a year and a half down the line. And just so everyone knows, that 2011 first round pick turned out to be Nikola Mirotic. So there's one of many wasted assets. Nevertheless, though, the Suns would go on to finish with only 25 wins, and midway through the 2012-2013 season, head coach Alvin Gentry would lose his job and eventually be replaced by Jeff Hornacek, who was hired by the new general manager in Ryan McDonough. Now, when you lose a bunch of games, obviously you get a top draft pick, and that's exactly what the Phoenix Suns were banking on. However, they botched their 2013 first rounder, which was the 5th overall pick, by selecting Alex Len, who now is not even on the team anymore. But even with the Suns dropping the ball with their draft pick, the 2013 offseason would go down as easily the most progressive summer for the Suns during this 9-year drought, as the Suns were able to trade Luis Scola after playing a pretty good season to the Indiana Pacers Sixers and in return receive Gerald Green, Miles Plumlee, and a 2014 first rounder. Also, they were able to trade a bunch of other players that included Marcin Gortat to the Washington Wizards and in return receive Emeka Okafor, who didn't play any games for them whatsoever. However, they also received another 2014 first rounder, and most importantly, they were able to acquire Eric Bledsoe via a 3-team trade from the Los Angeles Clippers. At this time, Eric Bledsoe had only been in the league for 3 years, and unfortunately for him, his role and importance started to diminish while playing in LA thanks to the arrival of Chris Paul. In search for a better fit, as well as not willing to pay Eric Bledsoe as he was coming off of his rookie contract in the following summer, the Clippers put Eric Bledsoe on the chopping block in hopes that they would get a good return, in which they received JJ Redick. But when it comes to the Phoenix Suns, they were looking to maximize the potential of a young guard that had a lot of promise, and that is exactly what they were able to do. As Eric Bledsoe, Goran Dragic, as well as the rest of the Phoenix Suns went on to surprise the NBA world during the 2013-2014 season as they finished the year off with a 48-win record, which is extremely impressive. A rookie head coach, a rookie general manager, and a bunch of miscellaneous pieces that no one really wanted in the year prior. Now, unfortunately, 48 wins in the Western Conference, that wasn't enough to make the playoffs that year. However, be very mindful, like I stated earlier, thanks to the Gortat and Louis Scola transaction, the Phoenix Suns were heading into the offseason with 3 first-round picks. Those 3 picks would turn out to be TJ Warren, Tyler Ennis, and Bogdan Bogdanovic, who was a drafting stash and wouldn't make his debut in the NBA until a few years down the line. Throughout the rest of the 2014 offseason, the Suns basically were handing out a bunch of contract extensions while also trying to make some acquisitions in hopes that they could one day make the playoffs. They gave both Eric Bledsoe and PJ Tucker a contract extension, and then when it comes to Marcus and Markieff Morris, they actually struck the deal. Markieff was the better player out of the twins and was set to receive a pretty sizable contract, however decided to take a pay cut in hopes that he would be able to strike a deal with the Phoenix Suns that would take away some of his money to give to his twin brother and Marcus Morris to give him some type of security with the Suns. And Ryan McDonough in the front office was willing to oblige to the offer that was on the table. Now, when you look at the depth chart for the Suns at this time, they had some talented pieces in very specific areas. Both Eric Bledsoe and Dragic fill up the guard positions, and for the most part, they were undersized backcourt, with Bledsoe only standing at 6'1" and Dragic standing at 6'3" at the 2 guard position. Then when it comes to the small forward and other wing players, you have PJ Tucker, Gerald Green, and they just drafted TJ Warren. So possibly another perimeter player that may be needed, especially because TJ Warren is only a rookie, but more or less they didn't need another perimeter player either. And then when it comes to the center position, they had Miles Plumlee, who was okay, but you could easily get a better player at that position. So you would assume that the Phoenix Suns would look for a center, right? No, that's not who they traded for at all. The Phoenix Suns, in one of their first transactions during the 2014 offseason, decided to go out of their way and trade for Isaiah Thomas. Yes, IT. Now, at this time, Isaiah Thomas was coming off of a really solid season. He was a 20-point scorer in Sacramento and trying to prove his worth in the NBA at least a starting caliber role. And in Phoenix, he wasn't going to be able to receive that role because obviously you have 2 other starting caliber players. A concern that everyone was very aware of, and it was so obvious that even Goran Dragic started to make his concerns known to the front office. And to subside Dragic's concern, the front office and Ryan McDonough basically promised their star caliber guard that he had no worries about his role and his positioning on this team, that he was still going to be a primary ball handler. While on the other hand, they were also promising a larger role for Isaiah Thomas in the offense, which obviously did not make any sense whatsoever, and it clearly contradicts both players' concerns. And throughout the 2014-2015 season, the chemistry that was built from the previous year that aided this team to overachieve to 48 wins completely evaporated, and by the trading deadline, both Goran Dragic and Isaiah Thomas were demanding trades. Dragic was traded to the Miami Heat via a 3-team trade, and without going through all of the miscellaneous pieces, for the most part, the Suns really only received 2 first-rounders from Miami. And then when it comes to Isaiah Thomas via a 3-team trade as well, well, he was sent to the Boston Celtics, and in return, the Suns only received Marcus Thornton and a first rounder. But what was even more head scratching was the third transaction that happened during the 2015 trading deadline. For whatever reason, Ryan McDonough and the Phoenix Suns decided to acquire Brandon Knight via a 3-team trade, and in the process lost the most valuable asset from the Steve Nash transaction, which was a first-round pick from the Los Angeles Lakers, who at this time was a massive mess, and eventually that pick would become unprotected. The Suns would continue to lose games and finish off that season with a record of only 39-45, giving them the 13th overall pick in the draft, which they decided to utilize to select Devin Booker. Now, in hindsight, we can clearly say that drafting Devin Booker was the greatest thing that the Suns have done in the past decade. However, at the time, it did not make any sense whatsoever. You had Eric Bledsoe, you had Brandon Knight, and you were going to give Brandon Knight a contract extension, which they eventually did later on in the offseason. So drafting another guard just didn't make any sense. You were literally putting yourself back in the same situation you had in the previous year. But that was far from the worst thing that the Phoenix Suns did during the summer of 2015, because during the 2015 offseason, one of the more recognizable names became a free agent at the power forward position, and that was LaMarcus Aldridge. So there were a couple of franchises that were trying to piece together a few things to try to make their situation more appealing than other franchises. And for whatever reason, the Phoenix Suns were one of those teams. En route to trying to persuade LaMarcus Aldridge to sign with the Phoenix Suns, Ryan McDonough decided to bring on Tyson Chandler on a 4-year contract. Mind you that Tyson Chandler was 33 years old at the time, and he was definitely past his prime. And the only reason why he signed Tyson Chandler was, again, to persuade LaMarcus Aldridge, because at the time Aldridge made it completely clear that he did not want to play the center position, or at least play as few minutes as possible. However, the other problem that the Phoenix Suns had is that they didn't have enough cap space to actually give him a max contract. So they decided to trade Marcus Morris to the Detroit Pistons, as well as Danny Granger and Reggie Bullock. Now, the only reason why this became problematic is because Markieff Morris felt like he was being backstabbed. Remember, just last year, Markieff took a pay cut to try to give his brother Marcus some type of stability, and the Suns were able to provide that for him. So the front office was just going to turn around and just trade Marcus anyway. Then there was no need for Markieff to take a pay cut. The young forward's frustrations would become so volatile that his opinions about the front office started to become public, and he also had a verbal altercation with his head coach and Jeff Hornacek that eventually led to him throwing a towel at his head coach, and that eventually led to him being suspended, which eventually led him being traded from the team to the Washington Wizards. And in return, the only thing that the Phoenix Suns received was DeJuan Blair, who was eventually waived from the team less than 10 days later, Chris Humphries, who also was eventually waived from the team 10 days later, and a first-round pick. And oh yeah, after all of that transpired, losing both Morris twins and signing Tyson Chandler, who at the time was past his prime, to a 4-year contract, the Suns didn't even get LaMarcus Aldridge. By the end of the 2016 season, the Phoenix Suns would finish with a record of 23-59. Halfway through the season, Jeff Hornacek would lose his job, and Earl Watson would step in as an interim head coach and eventually be promoted to the head coaching position. And just like that, we are right back where we started in the summer of 2013, with the Phoenix Suns having a top 5 pick. And just like they did 3 summers ago, the Suns botched another top pick in the draft by selecting Dragon Bender with the 4th overall selection. However, it still gets worse, because later on in the same draft night, in an attempt to snag another talented player in this year's draft class, the Suns decided to trade some pieces to move up in the order. To be more specific, the Suns moved up to the 8th overall selection, which was owned by the Kings, and with the 8th overall selection, the Phoenix Suns decided to go with Marquise Chriss.
That's gonna be a yikes for me, dog. That's gonna be a yikes from me.
During the 2016-2017 year is when the guard rotation problem started to become a bit more concerning. See, behind the scenes, Earl Watson was really pushing for Devin Booker to take over the starting role, as it was very clear that Booker had undeniable talent and he was poised to be a starting caliber player in the NBA. However, the front office, even Ryan McDonough, wanted that starting guard position to be given to both Eric Bledsoe and Brandon Knight.
That there was a push by management, and I believe it was Ryan McDonough, to have Brandon Knight start over Devin Booker going into that second year. Is there any truth to that?
It was some great debates, and it wasn't just Ryan McDonough. I had coaches on my staff who didn't believe it was time for Devin to take over the starting two-guard role. I knew that when you build a program, you know, the Brandon Knight and Eric Bledsoe backcourt can only take you so far, and it wasn't even to the playoffs.
The situation became so upsetting and detrimental to everybody on that team that eventually Brandon Knight wasn't even in the rotation by the end of the year. And oh yeah, Eric Bledsoe by the end of the year had enough and was looking to be traded as soon as possible. The Suns would finish the season with another losing record of 24-58, losing PJ Tucker along the way, and went back into the offseason with another 4th overall pick. This time in the 2017 draft, they decided to select Josh Jackson, who was selected literally 1 pick above De'Aaron Fox, who would have been great for this team. The Suns would go on to finish with a record of 21-61 during the 2017-2018 year, lose Earl Watson after 3 regular season games, which is completely unnecessary, and on November 7th, Eric Bledsoe found himself playing for the Milwaukee Bucks. And in return, the Suns really didn't receive much of anything. A few miscellaneous draft picks that more than likely will amount to nothing, and Greg Monroe, who is no longer on the team. And go into the 2018 season with the 1st overall pick, in which they decided to utilize to select DeAndre Ayton. And then with another 1st round pick, the Phoenix Suns decided to trade that, as well as a 1st round pick that they received during the Goran Dragic transaction, to move up to the 10th selection, which was owned by the Philadelphia 76ers, and drafted Mikal Bridges. Now, there are going to be some people who are going to make the argument that drafting DeAndre Ayton was the mistake that the Phoenix Suns made during the 2018 draft. However, the thing that's crazy is trading up to the 10th overall pick. The reason why this is so crazy is because the Philadelphia 76ers have this pick because they received it from the Phoenix Suns. Yes, this is the Los Angeles Lakers pick that the Phoenix Suns traded away to get Brandon Knight. So they basically traded away 2 draft picks to move up to receive a pick that they originally already had. The Suns would eventually find their new head coach in Igor and finally fire Ryan McDonough from the general manager position, which took way too long. And during the 2018-2019 season, the Suns would again finish with a horrific record of 19-63. And during the offseason, instead of receiving a top 3 pick, unfortunately, the Suns did not win the lottery and they fell out of the top 5, only receiving the 6th overall pick. However, the transactions that would transpire during the offseason was just ridiculous. They traded TJ Warren, who was one of the top 3 players on the roster, to the Indiana Pacers, as well as a 2nd round pick to the Miami Heat. And the only thing they received was cash, literally nothing but cash. They eventually fired their head coach in Igor after only 1 season of coaching. And then finally, the Suns decided to trade down in the draft, swapping picks with the Minnesota Timberwolves, and in return also receiving Dario Saric, who was a good player, but the transaction really didn't make any sense when the Suns selected Cameron Johnson, who may turn out to be a really good player, don't get me wrong, but on many people's big boards, Cameron Johnson wasn't expected to be a lottery pick. Which thus brings us to where we are today. The Phoenix Suns were literally on the brink of being a playoff team, being one of the biggest surprises in the NBA, and yet somehow, someway, they dropped the ball all within a year and a half and have pushed themselves down a path of irrelevancy that is equated to a 19-win regular season. But please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Peace.